Okay, so it's a great pleasure to welcome Ben Taylor to my nascent and very young and super amateurish series of talented humans in lockdown called The Lockdown. One of the reasons I wanted to chat to you, Ben, is because although there are a lot of people talking about AI and data science today, I think very few people out there really understand the subject to the level that you do and are capable of simultaneously understanding the technical side of things and also the business side of things. So hopefully this will make for an entertaining and useful discussion. But first of all, let's start with the obvious question, which is how are you? Where are you? Are you in lockdown? And how long have you been trapped, if that is the case?
I'm doing well. I'm here in Salt Lake City, Utah, just south, and we're a little spoiled here because we can get into the outdoors. And Utah has not had a strict lockdowns because I've talked to other people in France and other places where you can go to the store, but you can't go rock climbing or go on a bike ride. So in Utah we can still do a lot of those things, but people do wear masks. And so it's very interesting from a psychology perspective, the social norms. So a month ago, you were a weirdo if you had a mask on, and now it's the reverse. And it's just interesting to kind of see how the group can change over time.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're doing well. Looking forward to traveling. Appreciate you reaching out because it is nice to talk to other people that because you're kind of starved for interactions right now.
Yeah. So what do you miss the most from pre-lockdown life?
I I miss traveling. I travel a lot. So last year I was able to go down to South Africa, Madrid, Dublin, just kind of hopping around. And so I definitely miss that. I like working on a plane.
Yeah. Okay. So that's quite difficult right now, and
Yeah.
dangerous if you can manage, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess to get into more personal hobbies, April has been a hard month because I like to do backcountry skiing. And April is the time of year where the avalanche danger goes down. And so people ski these very aggressive lines. And I'd had a few in my mind that the general consensus in the local community is if I decided to ski those lines now, I'd be seen as a selfish jerk because I'm putting my life at I don't think I'm putting my life at risk, but I'm potentially risking first responders, people that might have to rescue me. And so this was a spring ski season. I had to kind of. It seems like a very stupid thing to complain about because there's other people listening to this podcast that they're in different lockdown situations. So me complaining about my skiing options feels very petty.
Yeah. Or like a hashtag first world problem, as
Yeah, yeah,
sometimes called.
first world problems. Yeah, I do feel guilty complaining about that, but
Yeah, so let's start giving people a little bit of a summary or overview of your professional career, how you got interested in AI, data science, where you started, where you are now, if you can summarize that briefly.
yeah. So maybe in the spirit of competencies and behavior, I think one of the topics that might come up during this discussion is this concept of competency versus arrogance, which I know you've talked a lot about this. So my background is all over the map, and I would say if I had to summarize it, I would say is a lot of confusion, a lot of jitter. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I enjoyed math. So a story that you may not have heard before, maybe we've talked about this. I actually lived in the woods while I went to college, and it made national news in the US. And it should have made news because I was a weirdo, but in the tech industry, people don't know what to do with that story. And so if they have to decide between weirdo and maybe savant or genius, they just err this way, which I guess that benefits me. But so I studied chemical engineering with an emphasis on biomedical. I got exposed to, so when I say biomedical, I mean biopharmaceuticals. And I really liked it. I did a lot of math. I was planning on going to medical school because my dad is a doctor, my mom's a lawyer. Went to a private school, so spoiled rich kid, I guess. And I got exposed to programming, and I just fell in love with it. And I think I fell in love with it for maybe some strange reasons. So I love the idea of a machine working for me 24/7. So it's almost robot slavery. Just can I have a whole army of computers constantly working? And I fell in love with that idea. So I So people see me as an AI nerd. So to kind of wrap up my story, I got into computer vision, um, did some stuff with nanotechnology, and then I ended up at Intel and Micron for 5 years. And my big breakthrough when it comes to AI experience came from working at a hedge fund. So I worked at a hedge fund as a quant on a 600 GPU cluster. And for people listening, building out a 600 GPU cluster today is crazy. In 2012, it was Wolf on Wall Street, just absolutely insane. And then I joined HireVue, which is a Sequoia company, and worked for them for 4 years. And that's where I got my first exposure to HR, which I love HR. I think initially there's kind of this awkward tension, the IO versus the data scientist, and I've got a lot of love in my heart for IOs. I don't see them going anywhere. And then after 4 years at HireVue, I went full time and co-founded a startup that was recently acquired. We did that for 3 years as a deep learning startup. Worked with a lot of great companies, learned a lot of things, and yeah, so that's a little
It's a
longer
great
than I wanted.
overview and clearly shows that you have applied, data science to very different areas and worlds. Not many people say I love HR, especially when they are not from HR. So
Yeah.
why don't you talk a little bit about in the last 10 years, maybe, what are the exciting advancements you have seen and been part of in terms of applying AI, machine learning, deep learning, and data science to the field of talent?
Yeah. Um, so, so, so I think something that's interesting is a lot of times we look at these tech superstars, the Elon Musks and the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, and we immediately say they must be really smart or they're geniuses. And really they're blessed with experiences because humans are products of our genetics and our environment or experiences. So I was very lucky because I had already been hooked on what I would call as high performance computing. And so I fell in love with CUDA GPU computing before deep learning arrived. And so when deep learning arrived, I was ready to go and hit the ground running. And so when it comes to HR, and maybe I'm not answering your question head on, but when it comes to HR started out as a very bad negative thing for me. And a funny backstory is when I initially found out about HireVue, the moment I found out they're an HR company, my response was absolutely not. Like I'll work for any other company besides HR. And I think that stereotype was coming from my time at Intel and Micron, where if you went to HR, it's because you had a problem, you were immature. So I kind of saw HR as the babysitter for the company. So if you don't know how to behave like an adult, then you're going to go talk to HR. If you're doing something bad, you're going to go talk to HR. So as I've ramped on IO psychology, I've seen this really interesting backstory where there's been a lot of science and machine learning with HR for a long time. This
Mhm.
isn't new. We've
Mhm.
had assessments, we've had science, we've had this development for decades. And this is something I bring up recently when people bristle at AI in recruiting or AI in HR. I feel like they're being naive to, well, what about all these assessments? What
Mhm.
about all these
Mhm.
validation studies that have been done for a long time?
Yeah. What are some of the prejudices that you see in this field, at a time where even people who don't understand AI very well are making accusations or critiques that, for example, machine learning algorithms that scrape interview data, video interview data, are inherently racist or sexist, that most of the technological advances in the space of understanding or identifying human potential via AI are going to make the world sort of more fascist, Big Brother-like, and the usual fears. What's your reaction to that? And maybe more importantly, how can you persuade people to understand that there might be another more beneficial or bright side to this?
Yeah. So the question you just asked is a huge question. We could talk about this alone for hours and hours. So I think to be very open about my biases, I'm a technophile. I love technology,
Mhm.
and maybe I love it too much. And when it comes to, so I've been involved with some very negative social engagements and press related to HR and recruiting tied to HireVue. So the Wall Street Journal did a hit piece called "The Robots Are Hiring." You can look that up.
Mhm.
And that piece was very upsetting for me because I felt like it was a lot of misinformation with an agenda. And I don't fault, I'm actually really good friends with the journalist that did that story, but it took a year to kind of get over it and realize that, that they have stories that, fear, uncertainty, and doubt are definitely good things to talk about. And we live in a clickbait society. And so I kind of want to break this into two halves. You have AI groups that deserve bad press. And those are, a lot of times when we review those, they're people that have no AI oversight. And so this goes back to my initial comment that I love IOs because you have the sexist resume models with Amazon. When you look into the details, there was no IO oversight for that data science group that did that. And you've got these different biases. So I feel like a lot of times people are reactive. They apply AI. I think to really hit on the question you asked is you were asking, why are people suddenly feeling uneasy? And I think because before we had assessments, but I feel like assessments, and this is not, hopefully this doesn't come across as being dismissive or negative with IOs, but I think if you talk to the general population, the assessments before felt a little silly. I'm going to go apply to Goldman Sachs. I'm going to take an hour-long assessment about personality. And in their mind, is this predictive? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We'll say on the call today, like it absolutely was. It provided value. It gave them a cut score. Maybe some good people were filtered out, but in general, it's offering value. But the public didn't really see the clear value. It's just,
Mhm.
it's not scary. But
Can
when you
you,
get in, yeah,
yeah, sorry, finish the
yeah.
thought, and then I'm going to ask you something specifically about this area.
So in my mind, if I had to oversimplify, I'd say we went from silly, and please know there's a lot of respect here. It's
Mhm.
not silly, but it went from silly to personal,
Yeah.
very, very personal. And so if I have a video camera pointed at you, what am I figuring out about you? Like what hooks am I getting in there? And I definitely don't want to escape the criticism that there's a Black Mirror play here. We can go into features where people's eyes will get bigger and they'll say, this is bad. This should not happen. Um,
Yeah.
so it's complicated.
Yeah. Talk a little bit, just to pick one variable that is often overlooked, I would say, at least in terms of bias, which is attractiveness, right? Just
Yeah.
to, I know that you have done a lot of very interesting and somewhat controversial work there, but let's assume that all the research from industrial organizational psychology that shows that there is general and pretty pervasive attractiveness bias underlying selection methods, whereby people who are generally seen within one society or culture as more attractive get an unfair advantage because they're selected more often in interviews and job selection contexts. Where would AI or a more pure data approach might be able to offer a better alternative that is not just more accurate in terms of selecting the best person, but also more ethical in terms of debiasing that? Can you explain that and talk a little bit about the work you've done?
Yeah. So I love the topic of attraction. I do like things that are more controversial because they kind of wake people up, and it's an interesting conversation. So attraction is fascinating because it's really part of our DNA. Like, we are attracted to other people, we are attracted to our partners. We are engineered to behave this way. And and, and I think it was a couple of years ago I did some of this analysis, and this actually ties back to your last question. If you are being very negative about AI in the concept of HR, I can fight you on that topic. And I found that that's very exhausting. And in these social, like on Twitter and different places, I actually can't convince you because you're so opinionated on your stance. I can't convince you. And so I've disengaged from those direct fights on social media, and I have switched to the human Black Mirror. So there's Black Mirror, which is a hashtag popular Netflix show. It's tied to bad AI, but I like to talk about the Black Mirror, human Black Mirror. So if you're saying AI is evil and bad, let's look at what the humans are doing. And so that's where this attractiveness analysis came in. Is it's a tricky thing to do because if you reached out to a Fortune 100 company and said, please give me all your recruiting data or all your hiring data with images and demographics, and I'd like to do some analysis, that would never happen. Their legal department won't allow it because you might find a needle in the haystack or something embarrassing. So I found a data set called the First Impression data set. It's about I remember I forget the exact numbers, 10,000 YouTube clips, and they have outcomes where people have decided what the first impression was. So without even looking at the data set, I immediately knew how they did the study. I knew that's racist, and it's probably going to have a detraction bias. And so I did this post where I did the analysis, showed it was racist. But even more, when you looked at the white male versus a black female, the cut score plot was very concerning. It would have been a class action lawsuit if it existed in a real company.
Mm-hmm.
But the beauty bias was even worse than the racial bias.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are a top tier attractive female versus a bottom tier attractive female, that bias was significant. And I presented this in Chicago at PsyOp. And before presenting it, some of the people that I'm close to were terrified,
Mm-hmm.
thinking like, what are you doing? Like, they didn't know how the community would react, but the IO psychologists, they all nodded their heads and said, we've already known about this.
So in
But
other words, the finding is that although there was adverse impact for race, meaning that if you're in a minority ethnic group, you were disadvantaged, the adverse impact for attractiveness or being unattractive was even stronger. So in other
yes,
words, you're better off being ethnic minority deemed attractive than a norm group from an ethnical group, but unattractive within, or deemed unattractive within that group.
yeah. For this particular data set, that was true. That could change depending on the job role and depending on the region.
What was the outcome on that data set, or the outcomes when you said that you could analyze, or what were you trying to predict?
So the metric, this wasn't tied to performance. It was, they had Mechanical Turks, which are strangers on Amazon,
Mm-hmm.
that would look at a 10-second clip of you,
Mm-hmm.
and they would rate you on, I think they were doing Big Five personality,
I see.
but they added an extra metric, and it was, should you continue on in an interview? So it was, so like any IO listening should laugh at that and say, okay, so this is not performance data, but it's an impression or a bias. And with HireVue, we found it was much easier to predict how you would do on an interview than it was to predict downstream value.
Yeah.
And so we always want to predict on defensible performance, but when it's coming to first impression and some of these different things that happen sooner, they are more productive. And so beauty was one of those examples. And I want to be very clear for anyone listening, HireVue does not use beauty at all as a feature.
Mm-hmm.
This was external to HireVue. I did that study and showed that it has a severe bias.
Yeah. So if you could today, use any technological resource and tool available to determine whether somebody has more or less potential for a role, and there were no ethical or legal restrictions, what do you think would be the most indicative or predictive signals? How would you approach this? Or maybe a different way of asking you this question is, in 50 years' time, how should the field advance to make selection more accurate and also more fair, or at least move towards a talent world that is as meritocratic as possible, where the best person truly is appointed or selected for the right job or the best job?
Yeah, there's two parts of this. So on the model building side, one of the things we talk about with data scientists, they want to go on a feature hunt. I think they do have to work closely with an IO group. And so by a feature hunt, I mean, I just want more and more and more features. So if I thought I could get your accelerometer data from your phone from the last week, I want it. If I thought I could get your Facebook feed, I want it. IO psychologists will react to this and say, wait, it has to be predictive of performance, but it has to be job related.
Mm-hmm.
It can't have a bias. And so they would argue against me to say, these are not job related.
Whereas you want to know what I watch on Netflix, what I listen to Spotify, what I bought in the grocery store, everything. You put in everything.
Yeah, even your DNA. So if I could get your 3 billion base pairs, I'd say thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
And that's coming from this data science crowd, where that reminds me of the days at the hedge fund where it was all about alpha. Mm-hmm. So alpha is the model's ability to predict. But then there's another discussion here. So we can talk about the ethics of that. But the other discussion, a lot more research has to be done on what counts as performance. Because I feel like for a lot of roles that we bring up, some roles are easy, where it's call center. Call center is probably the easiest one. So I know first call resolution. I know what your manager thinks about you. I know what the customer feedback score is. That's pretty clear. But then the
Yeah.
next step would be like sales. Sales might sound easier, but it's problematic because it's your sales area is San Francisco and mine is like Buffalo or
Yeah.
some, you and I could argue about that's not fair. And so you have to do some normalizations. But then you get into things like a flight attendant. And what is their performance? They
Yeah.
don't have a performance currently, but this is where the new research can be done. I feel like this is probably overly ambitious and people might disagree with this, but I think there's a future where every job will have a performance metric tied to ROI for the company. And you might say, what are you talking about? Like developers, flight attendants? That's impossible. You can't do that.
Well,
But
I'm thinking the hard ones are more management consultant or CEO, right?
see, yeah. And that gets really hard because your sample size dries up. So if we're talking about flight attendants, we can talk about hundreds of thousands of flight attendants. If you're talking about executives, what your sample size is so small. And so, yeah, that.
But do you see technology disrupting that space? Because, you know, as you well know, we have seen a lot of applications of technology, AI, data science, etc., to less skilled and more high volume jobs or roles like flight attendant and call center operator. But when companies go out on a job search for executives, they still go out for lunch and drinks. Well, not so much now, right? But they still have very high touch assignments, including an interview with 4 or 5 raters, long assessment. Do you think we will see disruption even at that higher end of the spectrum of executive job selection?
I think we will with job simulations. So job simulations probably feel like they cater to the entry level worker. You know, can you go through this customer service scenario? But I think we will evolve to where you can have job simulations for an executive and there's a right answer. There's a right way to handle layoffs. There's a right way to handle a new investment round or like an earnings call or like, and I'm just shooting from the hip here, but I think you could actually see some job simulations that would be, you know, be very helpful to determine your competency or your ability to lead a company with this makeup. Because being an executive is very hard. That's a very hard role to fill. And I think you've done a lot more work in this area. I've gone through the experience of paying payroll and understanding layoffs and different things on a much smaller scale. And I've also worked closely with friends who manage that at a larger scale. It's very stressful.
So basically put people through the experience and watch how they do the job.
Yeah,
that makes sense. So let's change gears a little bit and leave the world of HR and talent and talk about an area that is arguably generally more important and now, of course, has more attention, which is the health pandemic and the current crisis. How do you see AI and data being used effectively to help humanity and societies mitigate this shock? And where do you see opportunities that haven't been leveraged yet?
Yeah. So this is a sore topic for me because I feel like if I look at the AI landscape today in response to COVID, I would say the majority of the response has been embarrassing. Like it's embarrassing for me as an AI professional, what I see out there in the community. And I'll be very specific. So how many times have you seen something show up on your social feed where it's good news, deep learning, pneumonia, X-ray detection, achieved world like 99% accuracy? And the thing that's really frustrating about that is a lot of AI professionals they haven't made the mistakes that they need to make. And so a lot of these studies that you look at, they're not valid studies. So even if you could convince me that your X-ray model or this particular model was useful, because that's a challenge in itself. How is that going to help a physician? How is that going to be deployed? How is it going to go into the hospital system? Does COVID get any benefit from this? But the bigger problem is a lot of these studies and AI attempts you see online, they're actually not valid. They're misleading. They're we're finding target leakage. We're finding other things where even the data that you're seeing in your social feed is not right. And and these models that predict the spread. You have the IHME model out of Washington. Like you've seen this in the news that all of these models have been extremely disappointing.
Yeah, I was going
Where
to
they're
ask you about that. I mean, the predictions seem to have been pretty off. I think that the best article I read about predictions was the one that said, "Well, we can't predict anything, and basically that's the only thing we know." What is your sense on this? I mean, it seems like we've almost gone back in terms of progress where we
yeah.
thought we were, and for sure, it seems like. I don't know if you think that this has highlighted that AI and data science were not as advanced as we thought, or do you think more is it the case that people who are in charge of doing this are not as good as they could be? Which of the two is it?
Um. So a big part of it is having access to data that can be trusted.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that's really surprising right now is the death rates in the US. I think you have a feed from the New York Times, you have another feed from John Hopkins. They disagree. So the
Mm-hmm.
death, like something as simple as death,
Mm-hmm.
because I think from a statistical point of view, you and I would say, well, death should be a great metric.
Mm-hmm.
Like it should be a sound metric.
Mm-hmm.
But these two data sources disagree on the death rates, like the actual death counts in the
Yeah,
US. And
because I
so
mean, mostly places already, there's one clear distinction between whether you had to test positive to be declared as having died from COVID-19, or
yeah.
whether the symptoms alone are enough. And, I guess even different hospitals can have different criteria.
Yeah. So I don't want to dodge the blame either, to just say, well, if we had better data quality, we would do better. Because if you look at some of these models, they're very simple, they're oversimplified. They're
Mm-hmm.
essentially just curve fitting to the data. In So a lot of these models, they don't predict the second wave and the third wave. And in the reality, if you talk to a physician, that's the reality.
Mm-hmm.
We are expecting a second wave. We're expecting a third wave. But you look at all these models, and it's just a nice little bell curve going back. And then every day they adjust it because their predictions are so off.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And in
Reminds me
this,
sometimes of forecasts for political elections, where if you have to change the percentage on a daily basis, then why should I trust, yesterday's forecast?
yeah, yeah. So there's lots of ways that AI can help when it comes to COVID. I think this is something that's very upsetting that I found out in the U.S. So I was talking to a senior health informationist, which is essentially a data scientist equivalent, but they're inside the hospital network. They have access to everything you and I would dream of getting access to. They have all the patient level data. And I was talking to them, and they were essentially saying, we haven't had enough people die in Utah for us to learn these insights yet. And to unpack that, you have 8 different hospital networks. So these networks are massive. They have tens, 20, hundreds of hospitals in this network. They are unable to share data from a legal perspective. So Utah has not had enough people die yet to understand the drivers on who should go on a ventilator, who's at risk, who's going to develop this type of death outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Where New York's had plenty, but New York is unable to share.
Mm-hmm.
And so that highlights a failure of the U.S.
System.
healthcare system, because there's so much legal liability with HIPAA
Yeah.
that they don't have a formal data repository to share. So a big effort that I've been working on is getting access to patient level data.
Yeah.
Because patient level data with outcomes, AI can actually do a lot.
Yeah. What is your sense? I mean, especially in the early stages or beginning of the pandemic, there was a sense that more top-down, authoritarian, high-tech, to some degree, we could say surveillance states were better equipped for dealing with this because of their ability to capture data that was reliable and trustworthy, and of course, act on that data. And what I found interesting is that the response in the Western world to that comment was, oh, I wouldn't want to live in a surveillance society, so I'd rather have my privacy than a government that controls my moves, even if they can protect my health. What are your thoughts
Yeah.
about that? Do you really think that places like, let's say, China, Singapore, Israel have an advantage for dealing with this crisis because they're very high tech and they harness and act on data and they refine that data. And do you think there is an ethical issue with just applying that level of control or governance in other places?
Yeah, so I think Singapore definitely has an advantage. So talking to Lewis over at Singapore, he was saying, yeah, I can still go to a restaurant. But when he goes to a restaurant, he has to scan his national ID to enter. And what that allows them is if someone is testing positive, they can trace it back to, oh, you should go get tested again because someone came into this establishment. And so that we could never do that in the US because we would
But
see that
if you could, it would
if you
make
could,
it safer, you think?
yeah, it definitely make it safer. And so I've been very upset about this topic for a while. So before COVID, so my wife has chronic kidney disease, but we've been blessed because her kidneys aren't dropping. But her kidney function has gone from 100% down to 40%. And doctors have done a kidney biopsy. They took part of her kidney out. They've done all of this stuff for the last 15 years, and they don't know why. They don't know what's wrong with her. So in the year 2020, doctors don't know why. But when I go meet with a nephrologist, he's looking at a piece of paper, which is essentially her blood work or her urinalysis, and he's looking at 2 or 3 numbers. And so for me, I just want to scream where the joke is humans were limited to our digits. The number of numbers that we can do anything reasonable with, where a computer not only could look at, your DNA, your all of the insurance billing codes you've ever had in your life, all of the detail that could do that. And so so I've complained about this. And the interesting thing, you just brought this up, even complaining about it a year ago, I wrote this blog post called Millions Dead Thanks to HIPAA Privacy. Like I was definitely trying to troll. And I was bringing up the Vioxx lawsuits and very specific things where data had failed us. Like 20, 30,000 people had died from heart attacks because the data analysis had missed it. And I had people even then that were arguing that they would rather have people die than give up their privacy, which, and this brings up this other discussion that ethics is not a global standard. So what is considered ethical in my town may not be considered ethical in China.
Yeah.
And
when it comes to even privacy, do you think in the Western world, just to talk about places that go beyond the US, have we not given up our privacy already? I mean, what aspects of data are truly private and personal today in the Western world?
Yeah, no, that reminds me of Cambridge Analytica. When Cambridge Analytica blew up, a lot of people were shocked and horrified. But the thing that amused me was, for every Cambridge Analytica, there are probably hundreds or thousands of other companies that were using the same data to try to give you a better ad, to try to get you to do an impulse buy, and to try to understand you better. And so Cambridge Analytica wasn't the first person or the first group to use that data, but they used it for political purposes, which finally raised the alarm that you can force me to impulse buy, but you can't force me to vote.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, on Cambridge Analytica, and of course, they were doing a lot of things that were illegal, bribes and blackmails, etc. But on the data side of things, it seems like a lot of people were shocked by the idea that political targeting would want to know whom to target. And that has been the case, I think, for forever, since political targeting was invented, except before you had to invite people to be part of a focus group, give them cookies and ask them, what do you think of this candidate? Whereas now you can use their Facebook likes for that.
Yeah. Well, and this is interesting because it's a Black Mirror topic. And there's so many Black Mirror topics. So the Black Mirror topic is you have AI today fighting for your attention. It's already happening. What do you do with your finger on your phone? How are you being engaged by these different apps like TikTok and different things? And there are algorithms that are fighting tooth and nail to get your attention. And the future, the potential future reality, the future is always split like this. We have a beautiful future that'll make you cry. You're so happy thanks to AI. And then you have a terrible future. And from the terrible future perspective, you have humans drooling in virtual reality beds and algorithms are fighting for their attention during an 8-hour shift, but you don't care because you're in Hawaii, you're on top of Mount Everest and you're just being entertained, but algorithms are fighting for your brain cycles, and we've signed up for it. So
yeah. Or maybe you're watching Tiger King.
oh yeah, maybe you're watching Tiger King. I've been wondering lately what it would be like if the U.S. president was the Tiger King guy. What's his name? Joe?
Yes.
Yeah.
Joe Exotic.
Yeah, Joe Exotic. What would
Yeah.
that be? Would we be better off if he was president?
Or you could ask, the other way around, right? So do a switch, direct switch, and see. So let's on that Black Mirror note, and it's getting dark in here because there's a storm that is about to hit us. So it's, as you said, Black Mirror. I'm getting darker and darker. Let's think about the future, right? So is AI the last frontier of human evolution? What do you think of singularity? Is there anything after AI? Are you more dystopian, utopian, apocalyptic, optimistic? Where do you see us going as human society in this phase, and what comes next?
Yeah, so I've done a few blog posts on autonomous war. I think there are things that I don't think we can stop that are very upsetting. And Mikhail Kaczynski brought up an important point, because I was dreading this autonomous war that is the autonomous war equipment that will definitely come. It's already here, and it will just be getting more advanced. And I was dreading it, saying humans are about to create extinction level technology. And his response was, we've already had it. Nuclear weapons. We've had it for a very long time. It doesn't take a large investment for a bad group to, and this reminds me of kind of that black ball. I forget the name of the researcher. Is humans are inventing new technology, and we're pulling out white balls and gray balls, but eventually we could pull out a black ball that would make humans become extinct. And the example would be with nuclear weapons. What if it was so easy for nuclear fission to happen? It was just microwaving sand in your local microwave.
Mm-hmm.
If that technology existed, humans would be extinct. Like if it was that easy. Fortunately, it's not. So you have an autonomous war push, which I don't see how we can stop that. You're going to have the U.S., China, Russia, Israel. You're going to have these groups that are posturing. But you do have a very beautiful future that I'm very excited to see, and that gets into things like smart home. This is an example I've brought up. We actually had this terrible tragedy. We've had a few tragedies that have happened in our local community. And when I say local, I mean literally our neighborhood, like within a 5-mile radius, where we had a 3-year-old girl that was choked to death by a blind cord in her home. So parents are home, she's playing around, the cord goes around her neck and she chokes and dies. And this is a statistic. Like even today, these types of terrible things could happen to a loved one, a child, a grandchild, a neighbor. And in the future, your smart home, and this is not science fiction, in the future, your smart home will track everybody in the home, where they are, but also their vitals. And you don't have to even be wearing a wearable. It'll know your heartbeat, know your heartbeat signature. So if you enter my home, it'll know potentially who you are. That gets into the privacy concern. Mm-hmm. It'll know you don't live there, but it'll also know that you're having a heart attack. It'll know that this girl's being strangled. And so you can imagine a scenario in the future where I'm across the street having a barbecue, or just drinking a beer with a neighbor, and AI is sending drone paramedics to break down my front door to save my kid's life, and I'm oblivious. I'm like, whoa, what's happening? What's going on? And so that's exciting. Smart mirror. You're looking in your mirror in the morning, and your mirror is telling you have this rare disease. If you want to be a little bit more disgusting, it could be doing analysis on the toilet and different things, but very helpful things. So we had a child that nearly drowned in our local pool. Thankfully, they did not drown, but they pulled them out unconscious. The mother didn't even know their child was drowning, and I have no blame, because it's busy. Everyone's busy. A 3-year-old in 30 seconds can go and drown, and they had human lifeguards around the pool. They have 16-year-old kids that are paid to stop this from happening, but it's so easy when the pool's busy. So there's a future there where people don't die in drunk driving accidents, kids don't drown. Mm-hmm. People are never lost in the woods.
Mm-hmm. So you're optimistic.
I'm trying to be.
Yeah, you're trying to be. Okay, so let me ask you the last question, and then we've come to an end, which is not so much about the long distant future, but the shorter term future. what does the return to the new not normal look like? How do you see, our short term, whether that's next year or in a couple of years' time or whenever society starts to revert to the next phase? What are the things that will change forever? What are the things that will get better? And what do you think are the things that we'll miss, or, where we'll look back and say, oh, I missed this because I'm not going to have it again?
Yeah. So this is really interesting because it's forced a digital transformation that we've all procrastinated.
Mm-hmm.
And so working from home, working from remote,
Mm-hmm.
virtual conferences have always sucked traditionally,
Mm-hmm.
but now there's pressure to figure that out. And I've been on a few where I thought this is actually great. You've got like a live stream of comments, you're doing a panel, you can see what people are saying, you can respond in real time. And when we go present in person, we don't have that luxury of questions just streaming past us. And so I think there will be a scenario where we can never go back to how things were completely before. And is it better? One of the main concerns in the U.S. is a lot of these smaller businesses will fail. And this is a real example. So I've got a little 5-year-old boy that started going to karate, and because of COVID, his karate instructor has had to start doing YouTube streaming.
Mm-hmm.
And what that makes you realize is you're going to have a few winners and a lot of losers. Because if you're really good at streaming karate to an online social audience, you might cannibalize every brick and mortar store where no one tried before. So you have a lot of people trying. So it's interesting because I think sometimes when you see these hard disruptions, we definitely have empathy and we care about other people, and we're very upset about these businesses failing, these small restaurants that may not come back. But the same is true with AI, because when AI really gears up, there's a lot of jobs that will not come back. Like people listening today, they could have these jobs. These jobs will not come back. That job will not come back. And I think when we look at this short-term outcome, it's very upsetting. And I don't want to belittle the damage that it'll do for those individuals, because they may not be able to retool. They may not be able to jump back into the community. But I think over the long run, society is actually better. And the reason society is better is you have people that are being more efficient with their time. They're able to escape these processes and invest more time in creative work. And if I wanted to be really, I don't think this is that controversial, but I've complained about this for a while, and I've said, the reason why we don't have a COVID vaccine today? The real reason why?
No,
Too many humans are picking up socks. If you had more humans, and this will probably be very offensive, too many humans are picking up socks. If you had more people doing creative work, imagine if we'd had this digital transformation a decade ago.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine if we had a pandemic already, but at a smaller scale a decade ago. We would not be caught this off guard.
Yeah. And is there a sense then that now that a lot of smart humans are focused on finding a cure or a vaccine, what's your sense of, outcome, potential, or probabilities that someone will figure it out?
That someone could find a vaccine?
Yeah,
I think
I mean,
very high.
right now you have at least 8 very smart and well-resourced groups around the world really focused on this. Do you have high hopes?
Broke up for a second.
Oh, yeah.
Now you're back.
Yeah, so a lot of people, smart people, and there's at least 8 very, very smart, well-resourced groups that are focused right now on finding a vaccine and a cure. What's your sense of likelihood that happens?
I think if you look at SARS and MERS and some of these old viruses that we've had, we still don't have vaccines for them. And I think that we need some disruptive technology to come in and really replace the standard approach. Because the standard approach, you're looking at a couple years to develop a vaccine. And I said something online that a lot of people were upset about, because the US government is throwing out massive amounts of cash for COVID. And I said, I think Elon Musk should get $50 billion to go up a vaccine startup. And it's not to fix COVID, because I don't think there's not a big enough dollar amount to fix COVID this month,
Mhm.
because time is the culprit. Like time is the issue. But the argument was, I think in 3 years with that type of R&D spend, and it doesn't have to be Elon Musk. I'm a big fan, but someone with his throw everything off the table and disrespect what's been done
Mhm.
and bring new technologies or where you don't have to have humans be lab rats and you don't have to, take this approach. But so I hope someone finds a breakthrough today. I think there is a scenario in the next 10 years where we will look back on this response and shake our heads and say, isn't this nice that we get every new vaccine in 48 hours, like delivered to the region that needs it? But today it's a big gap.
Yeah. Okay. Well, fingers crossed that that day arrives someday. And Ben, a real pleasure chatting to you. Thank you so much for your time, your great insights, as always. You think very deeply and in a very advanced way about all these topics that are often discussed in a very trivial and superficial way. So I know people will enjoy watching and hearing your thoughts online, and we'll share them very soon. Thank you and stay safe.
Yeah, thank you. It's been fun.